Hello and welcome to this short coverage of derivatives from the CCL Academy to give you some insight into some of the complexities about derivatives. Lots of people get a bit jumpy, a bit nervous when derivatives are thrown around as a term and in some detail because they're unfamiliar terminology. It's a little bit complicated, and hopefully we can unravel that and make it so much more straightforward and clearer for you. So this short presentation is focusing on forwards and futures. Now both of those are types of derivative. As you'll see, they're both closely linked really, and you'll see the slides and I hopefully will be able to take you through those slides and show you what's going on. So forwards and futures. Let's roll ourselves back a little bit and talk about where derivatives started. So in terms of the development of derivatives, where they started, the origins were in the US. This all happened in the Midwest in the States. So in the Midwest, you've got a huge agricultural belt, lots of agricultural business going on. And if you try and boil down what a farmer does to simple things, so we've got an agricultural farmer out there growing wheat, let's presume. Now, in a nutshell, the farmer's job is to plough the fields, sow the seed, go back and sit in the farmhouse, watch that seed turn into wheat, watch that wheat dry and flourish in the weather, and then harvest that wheat and then sell it. Now, if we presume that the growing season between sowing the seed and harvesting the wheat is about 3 months, well, the farmer has got a 3-month period where the farmer is sitting in the farmhouse watching the wheat grow and begin to mature, and throughout that 3-month period the farmer has got no idea how much he's going to be able to sell his wheat for. He's got to wait until it's harvested before he knows how much he's going to get for his wheat. Now, it would be ideal, wouldn't it, if the farmer could know in advance of harvesting that wheat how much he will get when he sells the wheat. And on the other side of the coin, if you think of a baker that's perhaps going to buy the wheat to grind and make into flour to bake the bread, well, it would be great if the baker knew in advance how much he would have to pay for the wheat that he was going to use to grind and make the flour and therefore bake the bread. So we've got two participants, haven't we? That 3 months perhaps in advance, it would be good for both of them if they could fix the price at which the wheat is going to be sold at a future date. Now, this whole idea is what they call hedging. This is hedging in the financial markets. Hedging is reducing risk, and the farmer would reduce the risk by locking in a price at which they'd be able to sell the wheat. The baker would be hedging by locking in the price at which they buy the wheat. And if they did that, so 3 months ahead of time, we've got the farmer agreeing with the baker how much they'll sell the wheat for, how much of it there will be, locking in the price at that stage. That's technically referred to as a forward. A forward is one form of derivative, and forwards is the origin of derivatives. And you can see agricultural products absolutely perfect for that kind of setup, locking in a sale price ahead of time. Now, if we're thinking the US and the Midwest, this great big agricultural belt, what have we got in the middle of that agricultural belt? Well, we've got the Great Lakes and we've got Chicago. And Chicago is still the world centre for derivatives trading. That's where it all started. So it all started with these agricultural markets fixing prices in advance using forwards. Now, terminology. The way forwards are described is forwards are a form of OTC derivative. OTC stands for over the counter. And all it means is it means deals are done between participants. So on the one side we've got the farmer, on the other side we've got the baker. The deal is done. 3 months later, the farmer harvests the wheat, supplies it to the baker pays over the money. So the deal is done over the counter. It's an OTC style of derivative, a forward. Now, since forwards were introduced, things have moved on. And in particular, we've seen the development of what we call futures. Now, futures are, in principle, they're the same as forwards. In other words, you get two participants. They agree a deal ahead of time. The deal specifies a certain quantity, like 1,000 bushels of a certain underlying product, like wheat, and it specifies a delivery date, like 3 months ahead. It will also include a price. So futures are the same as forwards in that sense, but futures change, they differ from forwards in that they're traded on financial markets. So if you've got the equivalent of a forward, but it's trading on a financial market, a derivatives exchange, if you like, then it's not called a forward anymore. It's called a future, a futures contract. So we can see the two things are very, very similar. The key distinction is that futures are traded on exchange, whereas forwards are traded in what we call the OTC market, which is short for over the counter. Now these are two key types of derivative, and that's what we're covering in this short presentation here, those two, forwards and futures. So we've got this development of forwards into these more sophisticated forms of derivative, including futures that are tradable, can be bought and sold, and we'll see some more about them in a second. And they form two major types of derivative alongside another two major types of derivative. There are four in total you've got to worry about. They are forwards and futures. Begun to talk about those, obviously. The other two are options and swaps. And we will talk about those later in a subsequent video. So let's begin to look at futures. Now, I'm going to change my emphasis a little bit. I'm going to move away from futures based on agricultural products, and I'm going to look at futures based on what are often termed energy products, in particular oil. Oil is energy producing, obviously, and it's used a lot. And we're going to look at futures and how they could be used to perhaps hedge oil production or oil consumption, as you'll see. Now you can see on the slide, the first thing to say is what I think we've already established, which is a future is a legally binding obligation between two participants, two parties to the contract. One is committing to buy something at a future date. The other is committing to sell that something at the future date. And what is being specified at the outset is how much oil we're talking about. It's 1,000 barrels. What grade of oil we're talking about, and that's typically done by reference to the oil field the oil is coming from. So this could be Brent crude oil coming from the Brent oil fields in the North Sea. So we've got the quantity, we've got the specified quality, and we've got a particular date. Now, let's persist with this idea of 3 months. So we're talking about a delivery date that is 3 months later than the date the deal is first entered into. So we've got two parties, a buyer committing to buy, a seller committing to sell. The buyer is committing to buy 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil in 3 months. The seller is committing to sell that 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil in 3 months, and they are agreeing a price at the outset, and I'm going to presume the price is $65 a barrel, which is approximately where the oil price sits at the time we're making this particular video. So that's the idea. So what we've got is we've got a simple example. The buyer is agreeing to buy 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil for $65 a barrel in 3 months' time from a seller. Now, who are the buyer? Who is the buyer likely to be? Who's the seller likely to be? Well, the buyer could be an electricity generating company that's got lots of oil-fired power stations. It's nice for them to know the price they've got to pay for oil in advance, to hedge, to lock in the price they've got to pay for their oil. The seller in the contract may well be an oil producing company, an oil company. ExxonMobil, perhaps, the biggest oil company in the world. It's nice for them to know in advance of time how much they're going to get for the oil they produce. So you can see the logic. These two parties are reducing the risk they face by entering into this oil futures contract. Okay, now I've already told you the particular features of futures. To separate them from what we mentioned were forwards beforehand is that they are traded on an exchange. So they're traded on an exchange. And to have them traded on an exchange, the exchange will do what we call a process of standardization. They will standardize the contract. They'll say something like the minimum contract is for 1,000 barrels of oil at each time. So minimum contract 1,000. If you want to commit to buy 1,000, you buy one contract. If you want to commit to buy 5,000, you buy 5 contracts. So they will standardize the contract size, and they will also standardize the delivery dates. And typically on derivative exchanges around the world, 3 months is a pretty standard delivery period. So they will have delivery dates every quarter. Perhaps the 25th of March, and then the 25th of June, and then the 25th of September, and the 25th of December. So perhaps those will be the delivery dates, the specified delivery dates, every 3 months. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So that's the background to futures. Now, you appreciate at this stage, I hope, why futures might be used, why forwards might be used, so that the participants can hedge their risk. Yeah? And let's continue with that as being the rationale for using these derivatives, and let's highlight some terminology. If you're doing some sort of exam on derivatives, the examiner likes you to be aware of the key elements of terminology, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you on the next slide. So here we've got some futures terminology. Now you can see the diagram in front of you. It's exactly the diagram that represents what we've been talking about in terms of an oil future. So we've got a buyer. The buyer is agreeing to buy 1,000 barrels of oil in 3 months' time at $65 a barrel. The seller is agreeing to sell 1,000 barrels of oil at $65 a barrel in 3 months' time. As long as this derivative gets all the way through to delivery, well, what's going to happen is the buyer is going to hand over $65 multiplied by 1,000 barrels, so $65,000 to the seller, and the seller is going to hand over 1,000 barrels of the particularly specified oil. 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil, for example. Now, we've got to highlight the terminology involved in that whole transaction and spell out what that means. And we start off by using the word long. Now, all long means in the financial markets, and specifically here in derivatives, is long is shorthand for the buyer. So the buyer that's committed to buy the oil in 3 months' time is the long participant. So we talk about them being long futures contracts. So they are committed to buy in 3 months' time at $65 a barrel. In contrast, the seller is short. The seller is described as being short. So we've always got a long, we've always got a short, otherwise you haven't got a contract. So the long is the party that's committed to buy, the short is the party that's committed to sell. So the long and the short. In terms of what happens when they open up, when they start this contract, we say the contract is opening, it is being opened. We have got an open contract until such a date is that contract is closed when, for example, it reaches delivery. So a contract is open between when the participants first get involved and when perhaps they get out, which may not be until delivery point. Yeah? So we've got this idea of opening the contract and the contract involving the long participant and the short participant. Now, the oil, the 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil that we're referring to here is typically referred to as the underlying asset. This is the underlying asset, the asset underlying the derivative contract. So the underlying is Brent crude oil here, and the underlying quantity is obviously 1,000 barrels of Brent crude oil here, because we're presuming they're entering into a single contract, 1,000 barrels. So the underlying Brent crude oil. The delivery date we've already specified is 3 months, so it's 3 months after it's entered into, so maybe that's the 31st of March because they're entering into it on the 1st of January. So it's the delivery date is specified in the contract. It's a contractual obligation, the delivery date. Now, in terms of this particular contract, any particular contract will close at some point. And the final date a contract can close is the delivery date. So if you're committed to buy, you're the long participant, and you're still there committed to buy at the 31st of March, then you've got to pay over the money. And the seller, the short party, will be committed to sell, and they will provide you with 1,000 barrels of oil. Now that would bring the contract to its close, and that's closing at delivery. Now, rather confusingly, a lot of contracts don't get to delivery. So what happens is before you get to delivery date, the easiest way to think of this is to presume that the long and the short reach some sort of agreement to say, let's forget delivery and let's just settle for some cash. Now what I mean by that is let's say we've got exactly the same contract. So the long is committed to buy 1,000 barrels in 3 months' time. The short is committed to sell them 1,000 barrels in 3 months' time, $65 a barrel. That was the price of oil when this contract was entered into. Now, subsequent to that, the oil price moves. So let's say we're 4 days before delivery date. And the oil price now is not $65 a barrel anymore, it's gone up, it's $75 a barrel. So the buyer is committed to buy oil for $65 a barrel. Strictly speaking, the date of delivery is still 4 days away, but the oil price now is $75 a barrel. So things are looking all right for them, aren't they? It's good, they've committed to buy at 65, what's currently worth 75. Now that's $10 a barrel. They're looking good for $10 a barrel. There's 1,000 barrels in the contract. So if they're looking good for $10 a barrel, there's 1,000 barrels in the contract, they're looking good for $10,000. Now, they often describe derivatives as a zero-sum game because what the buyer is making, so the buyer is looking good to the tune of $10,000 at this instance. The seller is on the other side of this contract, and the seller is committed to sell for $65 a barrel what's currently worth $75 a barrel. They can't do anything about that because they've contractually undertaken to do that. So they're losing $10,000. Now, if the two participants decided 4 days before delivery they just exchange some cash and rip up the contract, it's logical for them to exchange $10,000. So the buyer receives $10,000 from the seller to represent the inherent loss that the seller is facing and the inherent profit that the buyer is going to generate. And they crystallize, they close out, they finish the contract without all the hassle of actually delivering the oil, paying over all the cash. Just pay over the profit. Yeah. So the loser crystallizes their loss, the winner crystallizes their profit, and the contract is closed without reaching delivery. And that happens a lot. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That's forwards, that's futures. So have a think about that. If you need to rerun the video, have another look. And if you have any questions, you know where we are. Thank you very much.